I am delighted that we've got Fiona. She's a good friend, and I think you'll really enjoy what she has to share. Shall we give her a very warm welcome? Right. Do you not particularly like your books now?
I'm embarrassed.
Well, you look young
so
there.
old. Yes, that's
Yeah, all right, sorry.
embarrassing.
Fiona, it's great to have you. Thank you. Where do you live? Where's home these
I
days?
live in Buckinghamshire.
That's quite posh, isn't it, really?
Oh, very. My husband used to say, when he was asked where I live in a place called Gerrard's Cross. It's a very small place. One lives there.
All right.
And you know he was a Yorkshireman, so...
He was. Well, you were very discerning to marry a Yorkshireman. Was that the prerequisite? When you thought, right, I want a wonderful man, did you think, right, first he's got to be from Yorkshire?
No, that was probably the last thing on my mind, because I came from the wrong side of the Pennines, according to him, and according to you, because I came from Liverpool. I'm a Scouser, really.
Now, when you say Liverpool, it was sort of Greater Liverpool, wasn't it?
Yes, the Wirral, actually. And then people say, oh, that's the posh side. But it wasn't posh at all.
Okay. So you were born there and you grew up there. About how many years ago, give or take a week, were you born there?
I was born at the beginning of 1940, beginning of the Second World War.
Right, okay. All right. And into a large family, small family? What sort
Large
of
family. I was the youngest of 4 children, yes.
And your father was the local doctor, wasn't he?
He was a GP in the area, yes.
Now, being a local GP in those days was very different from today, but in the war years, that must have been very challenging.
It was. My father fought in the First World War, actually, but then he stayed at home to look after patients in the Second World War. And what was amazing was that my mother decided to make our sitting room into a convalescent home for loads of the soldiers who came from the colonies, yes. In those days, and they were wounded and they were in hospital, but when they were convalescing they didn't have anywhere to go, so we put mattresses all around the floor, and
really?
and she looked after them. She was amazing.
So you were a little girl surrounded by soldiers all over the world.
Yeah.
And very often in those days, I don't know whether this is true for you, the doctor's surgery was part of the doctor's house.
It was, yes. Yeah. There were 3 surgeries downstairs on the ground floor, and the waiting room and the office, and then we lived above it.
And was it a God-fearing home? Was it a Christian home? Did you read the Bible? Did you pray as a family? Were you taken to church, or was there none of that?
Yes, all of that, actually, because I think in those days most of us believed in God. We were certainly never given an alternative anyway. And during the war, prayer was very important, and we went to church, and I believed in God. And there was halcyon days, really, when at school we had a prayer and a hymn and a Bible reading every morning before school started.
So, Fiona, if I'd met you as you were growing up, maybe in teen years, and said, are you a Christian? How would you have responded?
Yes.
And that would have been a very quick yes, definitely. That's how you defined yourself. Now, you were sent away to boarding school, weren't you?
I did, yes.
And why?
Well, when I went to my first school at the age of 5, in those days we had 1 dancing class a week, which was part of the curriculum. And the dancing teacher got hold of my mother after a while and told her that I showed promise. Do you remember that expression? She shows promise. And so my mother got all excited about it, because she had been a ballroom dancing teacher in her earlier days. And so she started to ask the teacher what she should do about it. And the upshot was they discussed it at length, and this dancing teacher gave her various opportunities. And at the age of 9, I was sent 250 miles away to a boarding school in Camberley in Surrey.
And was that traumatic for you?
No, it was wonderful. I felt so privileged. My parents sacrificed a lot in order to be able to send me there, and I really appreciated that. And I was doing something that none of the other friends of mine weren't doing. You know, I was really excited about it, and I loved it. I was very privileged.
Didn't miss home?
Well, yes, I suppose you do for a while.
And there weren't mobile phones? You wrote, what, once a week or something?
We were allowed to write 1 letter a week, and they were read so that we didn't write anything negative. We would have been in dead trouble if we'd said
And
anything bad.
were the return letters read as well?
Yes.
They were they?
Yes.
Like prison.
It really was.
So you were doing your ordinary sort of studies, but you were studying ballet and dance.
Yes.
And I think it's true to say, a little bird tells me, you can still do the splits.
Do you know, I tried it the other day because I thought you might ask me that. Yes, I did, just about.
You did it.
It took me 3 hours to get up again.
Old age is a stage in life when actions creak louder than words.
Everything creaks, yes.
All right. So when you left school, Fiona, did you get opportunities to dance publicly?
Yes. I mean, obviously they encouraged us tremendously because it was an ordinary school in that we got as far as O-levels or GCSE, but we never went any further. And we took all our ballet exams, and the aim was that we'd go into ballet companies if we were good enough, but I didn't get good enough. But they actually allowed me to leave school when I was 16, just for a pantomime in the chorus. I managed to get an audition for that, and then a summer season. I went back to school in between. And do you remember what summer seasons are? They were variety shows that functioned all around the coast of Great Britain in the summer. And it was wonderful if you tried to get a really long one so that you didn't have to starve between the summer season and the pantomime for too long.
So were you one of the dancers on the front row kicking your leg? I can't imagine it, but I won't go there.
No, don't go there.
All right.
It was all very respectable.
Was there good money in it?
No, there was terrible money. We got £3 a week for rehearsals, and about 7 for the actual shows, 7 a week. And we had to pay £4 a week for digs, accommodation. So.
But you were presumably mingling with some big stars.
Yes, we did. We got involved with lots of different people.
So is that where you met your future husband?
No, I never actually worked with Roy. But it was through a mutual friend.
So go on, tell us who this mutual friend was.
Well, when I eventually left school, I was 17, and I went into a pantomime at the Coventry Hippodrome, which actually happened to be the longest running pantomime in the country in those days.
So
it went on till April. Yeah, so I made a fortune there, didn't I? And Harry Seacombe was top of the bill. Do you remember Harry Seacombe? And then Morecambe and Wise were second on the bill. And you all remember them, don't you?
Yes.
And yes, and they were wonderful. And I got to know Eric and his wife Joan really well. I did other shows with them later on.
They looked after you, didn't they?
They did. They occasionally, they used to invite me to their home at weekends, and they would fill me up. And then they'd give me all the leftovers to take back to my little garret flat so I wouldn't starve for the rest of the week.
Aww.
They were really kind.
Well,
good
just
friends.
tell us about Eric Morecambe, because obviously, even today he's revered. Was he as funny at home? Was he a natural comedian, or was it just where he was given lines by somebody else?
No, you couldn't stop him. I mean, everything was funny. That's what I loved about him, because he made me laugh all the time. I imagine that he had his down times and so on. He was a human being. But he was always on form whenever I was around, and hilarious.
And he introduced you to your husband?
Yes.
And how was that?
Oh, it was really embarrassing, actually, because one of the weekends when I was staying at their home, we were sitting watching television, and Roy happened to come on the television. And he'd just made a name for himself. And I'd seen him at the London Palladium, and I thought he was absolutely brilliant. He was so talented. So in a very stupid moment, I said to Eric, if ever you do a show with Roy Castle, can I come along? Because I'd love to meet him. I think he's brilliant. All right, love, was all he said. And I thought, well, that's not going to happen.
Did you know he was single?
I don't think I even thought about that.
Oh, didn't you? So you didn't think,
no, I was just
I could entice him. You didn't think that?
I was just a little fan,
Okay, all right.
But anyway, Eric's comment was so negative that I thought, well, he's never going to introduce me, so I got on with my life. And it was about 2 years later that Eric rang me up. by which time Eric and Ernie were performing at the Palladium, and I was in a show in London. And he said, "Hey, Fiona, I'm doing a show with Roy on Sunday. Do you want to come along?" "Oh, yes, please," I said. So I went along with Joan, Eric's wife, and just before the show started, Eric took me into Roy's dressing room to introduce me, and I was so excited. I thought this was going to be the best moment of my life. And it turned out to be the worst, because he just said, "Roy, this is Fiona. She's in love with you," and left.
But the question is, was that true? Were you?
Yes.
All right. All right. So what did you say?
Left me blushing up to the roots of my then blonde hair, wishing I could die, Well, what do you say after that? I was really shy. And actually, Roy was very shy as well, so we sort of just looked at each other like idiots. But we all went out for a meal later on, and it got better after that. But what I didn't discover until Roy knew me well enough to tell me was what Eric had actually said to him that evening. "Look, Roy, I've got this little fan coming to see you. She's quite a sad case, but could you be nice to her? She's got braces on her teeth and pigtails, but please be nice to her."
So you went out for a meal after, and did he then ask you out for a date?
Yes.
And was your heart pounding?
Yes, it was.
All right.
He came to collect me from the theatre, actually, because I was actually in this, do you remember, a long time ago, The Sound of Music, the original cast of The Sound of Music.
What, the theatrical cast?
Yes,
So
it was way before the
who?
film. Well, I understudied, I was a nun, but I understudied Liesl, the 16-year-old, and then I took over because she left to have a baby, and then I took over.
But you were 16 going on 17?
A bit more than that.
Okay, right. All right. So eventually you married, and so you married a star, and he was a star on both sides of the Atlantic, and really, in many ways, he was a very, very big star, wasn't he? Record breakers. How many years did Record Breakers run for?
It was funny because he was asked to do it, and they said, "Well, we'll just do one tryout and see if it works." They thought it would only last 1 year. It lasted 22 years.
22 years. And for some of those who won't remember Record Breakers, what exactly was it?
Well, it was a show to do with the Guinness Book of Records, organised by Norris and Ross McWhirter, who instigated the Guinness Book of Records originally.
So he was introducing people who were trying to break records?
Or had broken records, yes. Loads of people, whether they climbed Everest or run a marathon or whatever it might have been,
But Fiona, he did some amazing things too.
Yes, he was
Tell us about some of them.
complete nutcase, wasn't he? As the show went on, the producer said to him, would you try this record and would you try that record? And the way he asked him was he would have felt like a wimp if he hadn't done it, you see, so he had to say yes.
What sort of things did he do?
Well, he had to do a death slide from the top of Blackpool Tower, a third of a mile down to the beach, just on a wire. And he said that was his most scary moment of his life, because he just had a rope, the figure of 8, which he put his hands through over the top of the wire. And he said that they had to soak the figure of 8 rope for 24 hours in water, otherwise it would have burnt through by the time he got down to the bottom.
Amazing.
So he was really, really nervous. But as you saw him coming down, he was, "Oh, I do like to be beside the seaside."
Well, I remember as well him on I think it was a biplane, standing on the top of the plane, flying across the channel.
Yes, he wing walked from Gatwick to Le Bourget on top of an aeroplane.
And then the one where he flew under all the bridges on the River Thames.
Yes, he broke a record going under all the bridges in about 20 minutes. I thought that was going to be the end of him. I thought the people in the boat wouldn't slow it down enough and he'd be decapitated under the first bridge,
Amazing.
But he said he was much more worried about going under the water and drinking the water of the Thames.
So remarkable. And if I may, the thing that I always remember about Roy Castle is that it was totally clean. There was no smut. There was no blasphemy. There's no suggestion of anything crude, was there at all?
No, he made a conscious decision that he would whenever he did a show, wherever it was, and for whatever reason, that it would always be all right for people from the age of 3 to 83, whatever. He never wanted to do anything that was untoward.
Did he lose out financially? You know, would he have got some better, as it were, contracts if he'd been different?
I don't know. I mean, he was very happy with his life. He never made it big, like, you know, like Eric and Ernie. But he was very happy. You know, in those days, there wasn't the sort of star feeling about it and the celebrity status that there is today. He was just glad that he could earn a living doing something that he really loved. That's the bottom line for him.
Now, Fiona, we must move on, but really, it should have been absolutely idyllic for you. A husband who's well known, presumably earning a lot of money. You got a comfortable home, you had 4 children. Everything should have been hunky-dory, but it wasn't, was it?
Well, it was to begin with, yes. It was fantastic. Right. I gave up my career. Roy was working in America, as you said, and we were trotting back and forth, and he was doing really well. The children came along, and I loved being a mum, and so it was all fine. And then, obviously, having 4 children, once the children had to start going to school, that was the end of my travelling days, because obviously we made a choice that I would stay at home to be with the children. Roy would have to continue travelling, come back when he could. And I was happy with that. It wasn't a problem. But my problem was that I was a perfectionist. I don't know if any of you suffer from that dreaded disease. The trouble with being a perfectionist is that you never match up to your own expectation of what that perfection should be. And I was always struggling and striving to become the best mother, wife, homemaker, whatever it was. And I think the reason I was like that was that I always wanted to make sure Roy was pleased that he'd chosen me as a wife. But I would look around at other people, you know, especially other mums at the school gate when I was waiting for the children. And they seemed to be doing the things I was trying to do without any trouble at all. And everything seemed to be successful for them, and it never worked that way for me. And whatever I did, I felt that I failed. You know, it's really easy, isn't it, to look at other people and see their strengths, and look back at yourself and see your own weaknesses. And that's what I was doing all the time. Why can't I do it? Why can't I give a dinner party like this friend of mine does, and everything gets cooked at the right time? When they come back to me, that doesn't happen. Why can't I cook things that work, you know? I would try so hard, and I just felt that I was a failure. And however, and Roy was lovely during this time, because he was always trying to bolster me up and encourage me. But my self-esteem was rock bottom, and I just felt that I was rubbish.
Were you still attending church?
Yes.
Were they aware at church that these things are?
No, nobody was aware, apart from Roy, poor guy. He used to say, I don't know why you bother to go to church. By the time you get the children into the car and ready for church, you're in such a foul mood, it can't make you any difference, you know. And he was right. But as I would go through the church door, good morning, everybody, what a lovely day today. I would never have told anybody how I was really feeling, because I didn't want to let the side down.
Now, when you say how you were really feeling, this wasn't just, you know, an anxious thought every so often, a little bit of lack of self-esteem. It really was gnawing away at you, wasn't it?
It was, yes. And however hard Roy tried to help me, I always came back to this place of failure, whatever I did. I would say I was depressed, but I didn't have clinical depression, so I wasn't on medication or anything like that. But I was just very low in my spirit. And I just got to the stage where I thought, oh, the planet would be better off if I wasn't on it. I just got that low.
But then something amazing happened. Tell us what precipitated it, and then tell us what happened.
One day, in that desperate state, I went up to my bedroom after I'd taken the children to school, and I just got down on my knees and I cried out to God. And I said, God, if you're there, you've got to help me, and you've got to help me now, because I've had it. I can't go on any longer. That's all I said.
Did you regularly pray like that, or?
No. It was a God bless Mummy and Daddy sort of prayer that I used to pray.
Right, okay, so you prayed,
so
and then?
I hadn't even got up off my knees before the phone rang. And when I answered the phone, the person who was at the other end was a woman I'd met a couple of times. I would never have expected her to even know my telephone number, let alone phone me or befriend me for any reason. But what I did know about her was that she was a Christian. And she just said, Fiona, I don't know why I'm phoning you, but I've had you on my mind recently, and I had this sudden urge to ring you. She said, I feel as if you need to talk. I don't know why, and I don't know what you need to talk about, but would you like to come over and have a coffee and talk? So I had to recognize that this was God's way of answering that desperate cry for help at that terrible time. So I went round to her house then and there.
What, you left the baby with Roy?
Ben, my baby, was about just over a year old, I think, at the time, and I threw him into Roy's arms and said, I'm going out, and I left. Poor guy, he told me later, he thought I'd literally left him holding the baby and I was never coming back. He was probably quite glad about it. But anyway, off I went. And I think because I didn't know this woman, I didn't feel embarrassed to talk to her. As I said, I would never have told a friend or a family member how I was feeling. But she was a very good listener, and she heard me out. And to be honest, my problems were not great. You know, as you said, I had a beautiful home. I had 4 lovely, healthy children, husband who provided for me. I didn't have to help to pay a mortgage by working outside the home and all of those things. I was a very privileged person, and yet I was falling apart. And she heard me out, and then she asked me the most challenging question anybody's ever asked me in my life. She simply said, you know, Fiona, you think you're a Christian because you go to church, but have you ever invited Jesus to come in and take over your life? I said, no, I hadn't. Didn't realize you were supposed to. As far as I was aware, that wasn't in the Book of Common Prayer. Thought I'd done all the things I was supposed to do by going to church, having my children christened, and, you know, trying to do good things for people. I think I was brought up to tick boxes, you know, to try and get the brownie points so that I would get to heaven when I died. Had to please God all the time. It was all part of it, really. And I think that was also contributing to my sense of failure, that I wasn't matching up and I wasn't good enough and I'd never get to heaven, that type of thing. So she asked me if I'd asked Jesus into my life. So when I said no, she said, well, don't you think it's about time you did? So I just said yes. And I only said yes because I was afraid to say no. We were in the room alone together. I had nowhere to run. But she then told me that she had suffered from depression for many years, and that taking that step in her own life had totally turned it around. And I thought, well, if it's worked for her, it could work for me. I would have tried anything that day if I'd been encouraged by anybody. And I'm so grateful to God that it was he who intervened that day.
So you prayed with her?
Yes, she had to help me to pray because I wasn't very good at praying. But she helped me to pray a prayer, a very simple prayer, that went something like this. Please, Jesus, forgive me for the mess I've made of my life up to now. I recognize the way I've tried to run it hasn't worked. So you come in and take it over and see what you can do with the rest of it, okay? It was like that. It was just chatting. And he did. I didn't know what to expect. I was really worried at that moment that I'd have to try even harder to be good. And I thought, I'm not going to make it. But I also thought, well, if it worked for her, it could work for me. But at that very moment, as I prayed that prayer, I experienced peace just flowing all over me and right through me. And all the tension, anxiety, and fear that I'd lived with all my life just melted away. And in place of it came this incredible peace. And that peace has never left me. I've just known that peace ever since. Well, Jesus said, you know, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. So do not be troubled or afraid. And I'd been so troubled and so afraid. But his peace is not dependent on circumstances. His peace is there even when your world's falling apart. And I've lived to prove that for 40 years now, and to know that peace.
Well, now, I'm going to move on a little bit in your life, if I may, because, all right, you have this peace which passes understanding, but you are going to have the huge challenge, the difficulty of Roy being diagnosed with lung cancer. What happened? How did you hear about this?
Well, this is another interesting story because I'd always stayed at home to look after the children, as I said, and he insisted this particular time, now that the children were old enough, that I would go with him to Australia, so I did. And we had the most fantastic time and came back, and 3 days later I thought he still hadn't got over jet lag, and I was laughing at him. And suddenly in the middle of the night I thought he'd had a massive heart attack, had to call the ambulance and everything. We thought he wouldn't survive the night. And it turned out to be a very, very serious virus. And that took away, I don't know what, took away all the sodium in his blood or something. And he was dying. He recovered from that. But I think the fact that he had this virus enabled the lung cancer, which was probably latent in him for a long time, to kick in.
Oh, right.
And because of, he was so poorly. And so that was in January, and he was diagnosed in March. He didn't know it was lung cancer for quite a while. He hadn't seen any symptoms at all, and he'd never smoked a cigarette in his life. And so that when they started to ask him if he'd smoked, well, you must have smoked, you know. No, I haven't smoked. And he was actually diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. They said he had 3 months to live if he didn't have treatment, and 6 months if he did have treatment. So it was a huge shock.
Absolute shock. But now you're a Christian. He trusted the Lord as well. And how did you cope? You know, what was your reaction to that?
Well, it was quite funny, really, if it can be funny. But he was supposed to be doing a voiceover for a video that a friend of ours was making for a charity. And this friend arrived in the evening at a certain time that he was invited to come to do this video, the voiceover for this video. And Roy hadn't got back from the specialist. He was getting the diagnosis. And so I was chatting away to this guy called David in the kitchen, actually, and Roy suddenly turned up quite a lot later and said, "Right, lovely to see you, Dave, but I've got some news for you." He said, "I've got lung cancer." He said, "I've got 6 months to live with treatment, 3 months to live without treatment. It's the fastest growing kind of lung cancer, and it's inoperable. Okay, Dave, let's get on with that video." And off they went into somewhere else to make the video. And left me standing.
Yes.
And I felt as if I'd turned to lead. I couldn't believe it. I was in such shock. And I said, "God, what is happening? What are you doing?" And it was almost as if I heard an audible voice in the room saying, "Stand back and see what I'm going to do through this." And suddenly I realized that God hadn't abandoned us. He knew what was happening. He still loved us. And furthermore, all he was asking of us was that we would allow him to work through the circumstances we found ourselves in at that time. And actually that really did happen, because Roy was never one for publicity. The press were very bored with us because we never did anything dramatic, you know, so they left us alone virtually. And yet, through this publicity, it enabled a lot of people to know a lot more about lung cancer and passive smoking and so on. And it was quite funny because it was about 2 weeks, when Roy was about 2 weeks into treatment, before the press found out about it. And they were phoning me all the way through the night, one night, when somebody had obviously spilt the beans. And so I was just telling them what was happening. And I thought, well, next day there'll probably be 3 lines in the bottom of a newspaper, and that'll be it. I had to go out the next morning, came back home, and there was a row of cars all down our street. Got to the back door, and there was a row of reporters and photographers standing outside the back door. So I said, "What are you all doing standing outside?" And one of them said, "Oh, Roy will only let us in 5 at a time." I'm thinking, how many chairs have we got in our sitting room? Anyway, I said, "Well, you come on in and I'll make you a cup of tea, and you stand in the kitchen whilst you're waiting," you see. So I invited them all in. There was a sink absolutely full of dirty coffee cups, so I knew that Roy had been entertaining them all morning. And when the last ones had gone, Roy came into the kitchen and said, "Well," he said, "I don't know what they're going to put in the papers tomorrow," but he said, "I've told them all about Jesus." I went, "What?" He'd always been very careful about his faith. He'd lived it out in the way he lived his life, but he hadn't been too articulate about it because he didn't want to be seen as one of these nutcases. That's how he said. And he said, now I've got a platform. He said, if my faith hadn't been real, it would have gone out of the window with the cancer. But he said, it's more real than ever now, so they've got to believe me. And I have to say that all the way through, the press were amazing. They were very, very supportive.
But Fiona, you did lose him. He did die. How do you remember that and the next few days and weeks when grief kicks in, and grief is very painful, isn't it? How do you recall that?
Well, what was amazing was that just before Roy died, he had the most wonderful visions of heaven, and they didn't make him just peaceful about dying, they made him excited about dying. There was one lovely time when he saw himself in this beautiful garden, and he started to try to describe it to me. He said, but it's impossible to describe because it's more beautiful than anything I've ever seen on earth. He said, I thought I was a gardener, but this gardener's something else. He said, don't hang around, darling, you need to see this as well.
Well, you have hung around for a few years.
Yeah, but he saw the funny side of everything right to the end, and I just felt that enabled him to see his eternal destination. The very last time the pastor of our church came to give him communion at his bedside, there were just the three of us in the room, and Roy suddenly sat up and pointed to the door and said, Jesus is standing in the doorway, can you see him? Well, we couldn't see him, but we were so aware of his presence. That gave me the most amazing peace. And incredibly, even though I was grieving, and it was so unexpected, I was just filled with joy. It was like a well just bubbling up in me at the same time as the grief, which just kept me going.
There was an incident, though, where you had to sort of pull yourself up a little bit. I was thinking when you came back from Northern Ireland.
Oh, yes. It was a big lesson to me. Roy's autobiography was only published 2 weeks after he died. They didn't manage to publish it in time. And in a sort of silly moment, I just said to the publishers, if there's anything I can do, please let me know if I can help in any way.
In publicising it?
It's sort of publicising it, because I felt sorry for them, that they didn't have anybody. And I thought, well, just one article in the newspaper or something, that'll be it. And suddenly, within a few days, I was being sent off to Northern Ireland to do a television programme, which is called the Jerry Kelly Show, which is sort of a chat show. And so I had to do that. And on the way back, I came into Heathrow. And you know how where the taxi drivers have all got the people, that they're trying to collect on pieces of paper, the names on bits of paper, yes. And I walked through into this concourse, and just ahead of me was this young woman, and she fell into the arms of her man just in front of me. And I stood behind her and I just sobbed. I haven't got anybody to collect me from the airport, and I've got to get myself to the long-term car park and drive myself home to an empty house. And suddenly, God showed me that those were tears of self-pity. And I realized that was a slippery slope down to depression, and I wasn't going to go down that road. And I realized that there was a difference between tears of grief and tears of self-pity. So behind this poor woman, I stood, and out loud I said, stupid woman, pull yourself together. You've had 31 wonderful years of a lovely marriage. Now get back to that car park and drive yourself home and stop being a baby. And I did.
You did? You listened to yourself?
I don't know what people thought. I didn't care at that stage. Anyway, but it was a huge exercise and a lesson to be learned. And I would allow myself tears of grief, but if they ever turned into self-pity, I'd stop myself. We can do that so often, can't we? Be sorry for ourselves. It's all right for them, but then what I would do was to start thinking of all the things for which I could be grateful. And that it's amazing how that draws you out of any sense of self-pity, that gratitude. And, you know, you suddenly start dancing, think, I've got a bed to sleep in, I've got electric lights, I've got, you know, I've got electricity, I've got food in the fridge, I've got so much to be grateful for.
Have you ever, we'll have to call it a day, I love listening to your story, but Fiona, have you ever regretted becoming a Christian?
No. The 25th of February 1975 was the best day of my life. It was the best decision I ever made. Jesus has been with me every day ever since. I'm not a perfect person, but I know I'm forgiven. I know that I was able to start again. I long to be able to tell people what it really means to be a Christian, because we get the wrong impression through the press and so on these days. And what it means is that Jesus can change a life. He turned my life around. I am not a perfect person. I am not a perfectionist anymore. If you came to my flat, you'd see a lot of dust on my windowsill, and if you came for lunch, you'd have bread and cheese around the kitchen table, and that would be it. Yeah. But I don't care about it anymore. Do you know, those sort of things, I'm comfortable in my own skin, because it's so much easier to be the person God created you to be. And I just long for other people to know that peace and know that joy that only He can give.
Fiona, that's great. Thank you so much. Now, look, at the end, you will stay around. I know you're going back to Gerard's course.
Yes.
But you will stay around and chat.
Of course I will,
Shall we
yes.
show our appreciation? Thank you very much.